Whitney, Director of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley State University. I'm delighted you're here with us this evening. I'm delighted to be partnering this evening with the Reverend Wooden and Fountain Street Church. Thank you so much for making your facilities available for the debate of a very important issue. The inimitable H.L. Mencken observed that democracy is the theory that the people know what they want and get what they deserve. So the question before us this evening is, does Michigan need to push the reset button and draw up a new constitution? Is our state government and the way it does business so broken, so broke, that it has contributed to our decade-long time of trouble? Or has our state suffered mostly from poor leadership that just makes the system look bad? You get to answer that question on November 2nd. In accord with the requirements of our current 1963 Constitution, citizens on November 2nd will have the opportunity to vote on Proposal 1. And you can go to the Secretary of State's website and download it yourself. Take a look at it. It's very short. This is exactly what it says. Shall a convention of elected delegates be convened in 2011 to draft a general revision of the state constitution for presentation to the state's voters for their approval or their rejection? That's it. If a majority of you says yes to a con-con, delegates will meet next year to write a new frame of government. And this audience is certainly aware of some of the issues that have been so prickly. The death penalty, stem cell research, gay marriage, affirmative action, abortion, term limits, judicial appointments, school funding, university funding, revenue sharing, taxes, and on and on and on. On the other hand, would it be better to save the $45 million price tag of a con-con and tweak the current Constitution with amendments? Here to debate this capital question are two passionate, informed polemicists. Both served in the armed forces. Both are attorneys. Both earned their master's degree in Washington, D.C. and somehow avoided Potomac fever. And both came back to the Midwest. Arguing that Michigan does not need to hold a constitutional convention that would write a new frame of government is Bob LaBrant on your left. Mr. LaBrant has been on the staff of the Michigan Chamber of Commerce since 1977 as the manager for political action programs. He serves as the Chamber's lobbyist on campaign finance, lobby law, and redistricting programs, legislation. In 2008, he led the successful effort to block the petition drive that would have called for rewriting Michigan's Constitution. So he's no stranger to this topic. Mr. LaBrant is a former captain in the U.S. Army. Ralph, I thought you would enjoy hearing that. He served in Vietnam, and after working on the staff of the Appleton, Wisconsin Chamber of Commerce, he became press secretary to Congressman Harold Froelich of Wisconsin. Mr. LaBrant later became the state legislative lobbyist for the Metropolitan Milwaukee Chamber and eventually came to the Michigan Chamber. He's a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, and he did his graduate studies in public relations at American University, and he holds a Juris Doctor cum laude from the Thomas M. Cooley Law School in Lansing. I see he's also worn his best red state tie for the occasion today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bob LaBrant. On the opposition, arguing by contrast that Michigan voters do need to approve holding a constitutional convention so that delegates can craft a new frame of government, is former Grand Rapids Mayor John Logie. He is currently an attorney with Warner, Norcross, and Judd, where he has been practicing law since 1969. From 1991 to 2003, Mr. Logie served as the mayor of Grand Rapids. And during his tenure, he advocated that the city transition the job of mayor from part-time to full-time. After leaving the mayor's office, Mr. Logie received the Slykehouse Lifetime Achievement Award from the Grand Rapids Economic Club, and in the summer of 2004. At Grand Valley State University, Mr. Logie helped facilitate the John Logie Fellows Program, giving students the opportunity to apply for paid internships with the city of Grand Rapids. Prior to his career in West Michigan, Mr. Logie served as an operations officer with the U.S. Navy. He was also an instructor at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. Mr. Logie holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan, a master's degree from George Washington University, and a Juris Doctor from the University of Michigan Law School. Please welcome John Logie. Now, the format of this evening's debate was determined beforehand, and each is going to have the opportunity to make a 10-minute opening statement, and then each will get a 4-minute rebuttal, and then we're going to mix it up with questions, and this is where it's really important for you. Now, I'm an old classroom teacher, and I'm going to expect you all to participate, and if you don't participate, I'm going to start calling on you. So make sure that you have some good questions ready for these gentlemen, and then each will have a 3-minute rebuttal at the end of the evening. Mr. Logie, you may begin.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to add my thanks not only to Susie's and my church, but also to Gleaves and Ralph and the Hauenstein Center for sponsoring this opportunity. I want to warn all my friends here, it's a rich mix, as it often is, at Fountain Street. I see a number of fellow parishioners who are here tonight, and I see a number of other folks, some I recognize, some I don't, who are just in because it's a nice night or whatever your reason for being here. But I want you to have some sympathy for my regular opponent. This is probably our 8th or 9th time that we've done battle on this topic since we started some time ago. He's here in Grand Rapids, my home turf. He's here in my church. He's a brave man. Now, I want you all to be very nice to him. You can stick your tongue out, but I don't want to hear nasty things or you being unpleasant, because I want him to leave here. I want him to leave here with a good impression of our city and our church and this process. Well, I'm going to get right into it by asking you to remember, try to remember, when one of the newest departments of the federal government was created. It was the Department of Energy. It was created in 1977. And its purpose, stated at the time that Congress created this additional cabinet position, was to lessen our dependence on foreign oil. Now it's 2010, 33 years later, and the budget for this necessary department is at $24.2 billion a year. It has 16,000 federal employees and approximately 100,000 contract employees. And look at the job it has done. 33 years ago, 30% of our oil consumption was from imports. Today, 70% of our oil consumption is from imports. Thus, the success of the Department of Energy. The legislation that was designed and approved for us by the voters in 1963 did not plan, it was never intended to plan to have a full-time legislature. But that's what we've got now. In fact, we have the second most expensive legislature in the country. There's only one state that pays their representatives and senators more. And that state, if it were a country, would be the 8th largest country in the world. It's called California. And 42 states don't even have full-time legislatures. I raise this to get your brain thinking about why we might say yes on November 2nd. And my job tonight is to tell you some of the power that is inherent in a constitutional convention once it is convened and once it begins its work. And incidentally, it doesn't take all that long. Susie and I were up in Mount Pleasant listening to Gil Wanger, about 10 days ago, give a speech about CONCON, because he is one of the last living members of the 62-63 Constitutional Convention. And he told us it only took 7.5 months to do their work from start to finish once they were all convened and elected and started their job. So what I want to try to explain to you is this is an opportunity to take advantage of where we are now vis-a-vis where we were back in 1961, 2, 3, when this was the last time it was done. First, you need to understand that this is not a unique experience. In 1837, we were a new state, we created a constitution, and 13 years later, we decided, took a vote and said, let's redo the Constitution. They did. And it lasted about 50 years, till 1908, and the public decided, let's do it again. And they did. And then one more time in 1961-2-3. So this would be the fourth time after 1850. Why do I tell you that? Because this is a process that you need not be afraid of. It is a process that has worked for us 3 times in the past. Now I want to take most of you in this room back to what was going on here in 1960, 61, 2, 3. We had 4 major automotive companies, including American Motors and Ford, GM, and Chrysler, making all the cars and trucks in North America. There were no Hondas, there were no Toyotas, there were 1 or 2 little Volkswagens that had been ferried over from Germany that were driving on our streets. But they were shipping beyond us. Now fast forward and look at the companies that we have now. We were a manufacturing economy then. We were in Detroit, the automotive center of the world. We were here in Grand Rapids, the furniture capital of the world. Fast forward, we have become a service economy. So you need to think about, does the creature that Dorothy Leonard Judd, all her life a member of this church and a member of the Con-Con in 62, 63, what she was looking at back then, or has it changed, and if so, what should we do to recognize that change? I'm going to just jump around sort of quickly and get your brain geared, and in the Q&A I hope you follow. I want to address the issue of term limits. Almost nobody in the state wants to get rid of them. Almost everybody likes the fact that the rascals get thrown out automatically. But a well-meaning majority of Michiganders now agree that we probably ought to lengthen the time that they're there. And there's a particularly interesting reason about that right now. Whoever wins in November, it doesn't matter. We are going to have 50 new freshmen in the House who've never been in office. We're going to have 50 more sophomores who've had 1 2-year term. And we're going to have 10 people who have been there all of 4 years. I can remember when senators and representatives have been there 40 years. But that'll be the House. And it's even worse in the Senate. We'll have 8 people who have been there 4 years and 30 freshmen. And why do I bring that up? Because there's a learning curve to being effective on this job. Yesterday, Bill Ballinger was here from Lansing. Bill was a 1-term state House member and a 1-term senator before he decided to become a pundit. And he writes a very well-respected statewide document called Inside Michigan Politics. He was addressing the Grand Valley Metro Council yesterday at lunch, and I asked him in the Q&A, I said, Bill, you served 6 years in the legislature. How long was it before you felt you knew your way around enough so that you felt you could make a contribution, you could initiate something, you could get something started, you could finish it? And without knowing where I was going tonight, he said 5 years. And I have some connection to that. It didn't take me 5 years to learn all the corners of the mayor's job, but it took me a while. And so what we're going to ask this group of freshmen and sophomores and 18 people who've been there 4 years is fix all these problems. At least that's what this gentleman is going to try to convince you is the right answer, is that they can take care of it. We don't need a constitutional convention. If we need an amendment, they can just put it on the ballot, which I think is very interesting. It's true. There is a provision in this Constitution that says by a 2/3 vote of both houses at the same time on the same language for one subject, they can put something on the ballot. But to expect these underclassmen to do that and do it efficiently and timely across a broad range of different topics is, to me, a little sublime. I think it's much more likely that what we see in nothing getting done, you know, it's kind of interesting. The legislature has a constitutional duty to pass a budget on time. And it's just by a single vote in both chambers, a margin of 1. They haven't been able to do that in 2 of the last 3 years in the structure that we have now and the people that we have now. So to suggest that they're going to come together on a 2/3 majority and put something that we need on the ballot is not going to happen very easily. The phrase that keeps being used by my opposition is that We don't want to have to start over. We don't want to quote the Hauenstein Center when they said vote no on this the other day, blow up the whole structure and start from scratch. That's not realistic. My guess, having reviewed the Constitution, I carry a copy of it around with me, probably 60% of it or more, the Bill of Rights and other things, they're not going to be taken out or changed. But a much smaller part is going to reflect the changes that have driven us to the point we are now. One of the insoluble problems that I don't hear an answer from the other side about is we have a structural deficit on financing. 10 years ago, when I was still the mayor, the 4.35% state income tax, flat regressive tax, was still raising $10 billion out of a $20 billion budget. Today, it's raising 7.8. The state does not have enough money to operate. We're the 8th largest state in the country. About 10 million, we've been over 10 million. So what you need to listen to tonight is, what problems do you connect with? And what solutions can you connect with tonight to help you make a decision whether or not to vote yes, which is what I'm advocating, or to vote no, what he is advocating. There are lots of contentious issues out there. But the experience of Dorothy Leonard Judd was that they sat down at the front end and they knew that they had to avoid hot button items because there is a safety valve for all of you waiting at the end of this process. That safety valve is you get to vote yes or no on the work product of this Constitution. I'm going to be talking to you more.
Mr. LaBrant.
Thank you for the invitation to speak here tonight. John and I have done this numerous times. Why are we here? Well, Proposal 1, unlike many other constitutional proposals, didn't reach the ballot through a petition drive. It didn't reach the ballot through legislative action. As John has pointed out, this proposal automatically appears on the ballot in Michigan for 16 years. Now, the question I think voters have to make is to take a look at the Michigan Constitution. I too have a copy of the Constitution, John. And one thing that strikes me about the 1963 Constitution is that this is the 9th youngest state constitution in the United States. That means that 41 other states have, I guess, a much more antiquated state constitution, but they somehow managed to get by with their much older state constitutions. Now, for the past decade, I think all of us can readily acknowledge that Michigan has been in the midst of an economic crisis. But I want to point out that although Michigan has been in the midst of an economic crisis, it's not a constitutional crisis. There's nothing in the Michigan Constitution that caused the collapse of the auto industry in the state of Michigan. There's nothing in the Michigan Constitution I think really can be changed that's going to somehow restore Michigan to its manufacturing prominence that it enjoyed in the 20th century. Michigan's Constitution is sound. It contains no fatal flaws. Now let's talk a little bit about this automatic question. Michigan is one of some 14 states that automatically ask the voters whether or not to call a new constitutional convention. This provision has been in Michigan's Constitution all the way back to the 1850 Constitution. And in the year 1866, the first time that this appeared on the ballot, the voters went to the polls, those that actually could vote in 1866, those white males, and they voted that they would have a constitutional convention. The Constitutional Convention met, they came up with a new constitution, and the voters rejected their work product. So we went on to the next 16 years to have that question come up again, and every 16 years thereafter. Finally, in 1906, the voters approved the call for a constitutional convention, a convention was held and we had the adoption of the 1908 Constitution. The 1908 Constitution kept that 16-year requirement. Now, Michigan asked that question every 16 years. 9 other states asked this question every 20 years. 3 states, I think it's crazy, but 3 states asked this question every 10 years, and Hawaii asked this question every 9 years as to whether, in fact, a constitutional convention should be convened to do a general revision of their state constitution. Now, interestingly enough, in about half of those 14 states that have this provision for an automatic question on the call for a constitutional convention, 7 of those states, 1/2, do not have the power of the initiative. In Michigan, we have the initiative process. And so if we want to amend the Michigan Constitution, you and I as citizens, we can do a petition drive and put a proposed constitutional amendment on the ballot. And as John pointed out, we can, the legislature also has the power, if they can get a 2/3 vote on a joint resolution, they can put a constitutional amendment on the ballot, much like they did with Proposal 2. Now, Proposal 2 is the second issue on the ballot, and I'm not going to spend much time on it. Proposal 1 is con-con, Proposal 2 is ex-con. Okay? Ex-con basically was drafted to provide that no one who has been convicted of a felony involving a breach of the public trust is eligible to run for any office in Michigan, state or local, nor can they be employed by state and local government for a 20-year time period after their conviction of that felony involving a breach of the public trust. Now you might think to yourself, okay, what caused the legislature to do this? 2 words, Kwame Kilpatrick. Now, our Michigan Constitution, has been pointed out, has been amended some 31 times. So there is flexibility in the document. Since 1965, 15 state constitutional conventions have been held across the United States. Voters rejected the work product of 7 of those 15 state constitutional conventions during the last 45-year time period. The last state to hold a constitutional convention was Louisiana back in 1992. Louisiana voters rejected that constitutional change that was proposed by the convention. Now, 7 states this past decade have rejected the automatic con-con call. Interestingly enough, 2 years ago, in 2008, Illinois rejected a con-con call by a 3-to-1 margin, despite the fact of having Ron Blagojevich as their dysfunctional governor. Now, Michigan is one of 4 states this year that have this automatic con-con question on the ballot. Montana, Iowa, and Maryland are the other 3 states that join Michigan in having this automatic call. And I think the most recent published statewide polls on Proposal 1 has this attracting just 32% of the yes vote right now. And so, in all likelihood, Proposal 1 will suffer the same fate that it suffered 16 years ago when it was defeated with 72% voting no, and 32 years ago when 77% of the electorate voted no. At our last constitutional convention held in Michigan in 1961-62, the hot-button issues that divided the delegates along a partisan divide were redistricting and reducing the number of statewide elected public officials from 8 down to 4. Democrats weren't excited about the fact that the Constitution, the proposed Constitution, was going to eliminate the elected positions of state treasurer, state auditor, state superintendent of public instruction, and even back then, we elected the state highway director. So those were the partisan divides at the Constitutional Convention back in 61, 62. Over the past 2 decades, I'd like you to examine some of the issues that Michigan voters have resolved one way or the other. Controversial issues like term limits, like school vouchers, casino gaming, physician-assisted suicide, same-sex marriage ban, the ban on affirmative action programs, stem cell research, and medical marijuana. I think that those issues would be the hot-button issues at a constitutional convention held in 2011 and 2012. And why do I think that the convention will actually have to deal with these hot-button issues, even though John somehow thinks that they will ignore those hot-button issues and deal with just term limits and some structural things? Well, one is that we're going to have an election to nominate candidates for these offices on February 22nd of 2011. That's 112 days after voters would approve Proposal 1. And I don't know about you, but I think the voter turnout for that election is going to be minuscule. Whether we have a good day or bad day as far as weather on February 22nd. And as a result, I think core constituency groups within both political parties are going to play an inordinate role in determining who gets endorsed in those primary contests. And we're going to have almost polar opposites winning Democratic primaries and those winning Republican primaries. And when they are elected con delegate, I think reaching consensus will be much more difficult than we would imagine. And with that, I will reserve the balance of my time.
Thanks. Mayor Logie.
3 seconds, right?
You have a 4-minute rebuttal.
A petition drive to put an amendment on the ballot requires about 350,000 signatures. The current estimate of the cost to do that is $1 million to $1.5 million. So using that process is not easy or inexpensive, and it doesn't happen very often. And although we have amended the Constitution 31 times in almost 50 years, 37 others failed. So putting our hopes there as a realistic way to solve these problems is a very poor bet in today's market. Let's talk about the cost of this. That's been a big issue off and on throughout all these debates. The Senate Fiscal Agency thought it would be $45 million over 2 years to do a con-con, but they included in that 3 $10 million statewide elections. Under the new election system, we're probably going to have to use the February and June dates, and that should lop that money in half, but that's really not the issue. $45 million is a lot of money, but it's 0.000225 of 1 year's state budget of $20 billion. It is not a lot of money vis-a-vis what we're spending money elsewhere on. And if you want cost to be the driver of a con-con, let me tell you how to fix that problem very easily. If we simply cut the legislature in half to 56 members instead of 110 and 20 instead of 38, we would save $50 million a year every year after that. And if this Constitution lasts as long as the last 3, about 50 years, we'd save $2.5 billion just by shrinking it. And with better communication and better travel, I have no problem at all with putting the size of the legislative districts double what they are right now. There'd still be a lot of them in this state compared to other states. Moreover, that's not the only way to deal with it. Once you get this convention working, they might decide to just have a completely part-time legislature. So out would go their health care, out would go their pension, out would go their $12,000 a year slush fund they don't have to account for, all of which they get now on top of their $78,000, $9,000 salary. So there's a lot of flexibility here that can be used to get the job done. I want to talk a little bit about the justices of the Michigan Supreme Court. Dorothy Judd told me this story. Late in the convention, they all wanted to go home. They still hadn't figured out a way to get new justices to our court. So they made a big, big compromise. They today show up on the ballot as nonpartisan elections. But the only way to get on the ballot is they have to come through the Republican and Democratic conventions to get their appointment to go be on the ballot. So you've got a partisan underpinning and a phony, nonpartisan look. You are watching today the disaster that has caused. The Democrats spent $2.6 million 2 years ago trying to affect the outcome of justice races. The Republicans spent $2.8, and the Michigan Chamber of Commerce that he works for spent $2.9 million. If that gives you some idea of why these people don't want to change, you're on the right track.
Mr. LaBrant, you have 4 minutes for rebuttal.
We are going to be electing a new governor, and as John pointed out correctly, 29 out of 38 state senators at minimum, and probably a little over, about 50% of the State House of Representatives will be new to the State House of Representatives. Now, one of the things, as far as cost is concerned, is that new governor and that new state legislature aren't going to be able to just wait around and after the work product of a constitutional convention is somehow approved and maybe we go to a part-time legislature and maybe we don't. They've got to come up with $20 million to pay for that February primary. They've got to come up with that money to pay for that May general election to actually elect the con-con delegates. And so somewhere in fiscal year 11 budget, they've got to come up with $20 million to fund those elections, let alone some of the preparatory work of a constitutional convention. And as a result, some programs are going to have to get cut. I don't know which ones, but somehow we have to have a balanced budget as a constitutional requirement in Michigan, and we've got to find $20 million if in fact we approve the call for a constitutional convention. Now, I think Rick Snyder probably said it best. He said a constitutional convention would be an intellectually satisfying, an intellectually stimulating exercise. Unfortunately, it would likely refight the social wars of the past 2 decades. The state doesn't need that. Virg Bonero has said that he doesn't think that Michigan's economic problems stem from our state constitution. He wants the total focus of state government, if he were to become governor, to be on our economy and not on a constitutional convention. Gleaves, your old boss John Engler, and Jim Blanchard, opponents back in 1990, both opposed the call for a constitutional convention. In looking at what other states have done on constitutional conventions, in the 20 years since 1990, no state has approved a call for a constitutional convention. In 15 elections held over those past 20 years, the call for a constitutional convention across the nation has been rejected all 15 times. Michigan voters should reject Proposal 1 on November 2nd. If change is needed, we can change the Michigan Constitution one amendment at a time. The voters should not be required to decide on a yes or no vote whether to adopt a brand new constitution that might basically be 35,000 words in total. The Michigan Constitution today is about 35,000 words. So if we come up with a brand new constitution, you're going to ultimately have to decide whether there are provisions in this Constitution that you want, or there are some provisions in this Constitution that you find unsatisfactory. If we amend the Constitution one amendment at a time, you have the opportunity just on that one amendment to either vote yes or vote no. And as a result, I would urge you again to vote no on Proposal 1. Thank you.
All right, thank you, gentlemen, for your opening statements and your rebuttals. This is the time in the program now where The floor is yours. You have the opportunity to ask questions of our two experts.
Hi, James WJRW, oppose this to either. The best you can answer this question, exactly the specifics of how constitutional convention would come about. How would delegates be appointed? Would it be at the legislative chambers, or would it be at some place like the Lansing Center?
Where the convention would actually be held at?
The logistics and how this would be carried out.
Well, the logistics, I think, of a constitutional convention would, first of all, require certain preparatory costs. We would have to find, first of all, a location to hold the Constitutional Convention. Back in 1961, when we held our last Constitutional Convention, we had the Lansing Civic Center. That Lansing Civic Center has subsequently been torn down. So where's the next best place to hold a Constitutional Convention? Probably in the Lansing Center. So if I would think logistically that would probably work out. It's about 3 blocks to the east of the state capitol. They're going to need staff, and they can't really count on the Legislative Service Bureau to provide all of those services. So that will have to go out and be recruited. John, would you like to comment on some of the logistics?
Now, you've got 2 minutes.
Oh, keep going. I didn't know that. I'm sorry.
Now you got 1 minute.
I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The process marries up and looks like how we elect our state representatives and senators. Every House district and every Senate district, there are 148 of them, will have a representative delegate from that House district. And like I live in Heritage Hill, that's a Senate district, and also there'll be 2 people there. There'll probably be 30-some people from Metro Grand Rapids going down to this party in Lansing, if that's where they choose where they want to hold it, but where some staff and other things will be. So that's how they get there. And there's a very short electoral process connected to it. There isn't going to be a lot of money spent on it, because these are citizens, sitting legislators. Isn't this wonderful? Our 1960 people were very smart. Sitting legislators can't run for CONCON. And this idea that CONCON is somehow going to interfere with the passage of government is totally unfounded. It's never happened as we went through this process, because they are on parallel tracks. So it's going to take time. It's going to take February with a primary, partisan primary, a general election probably in June, using these dates that aren't going to cost money, extra money. And then probably in October they'll start to work. So for the first 10 months of this year, the government we're going to elect right now has to function. It's got a constitution, it's got laws, it knows what it's supposed to do, pass a budget on time and do things like that. And there's no record anywhere that the existence of a CONCON working alongside them on a different track has had any impact on what they are doing. Now, there's a lot of smoky stuff about, well, people that want to come here with new business won't be afraid to come. It's never happened. It's a complete fabrication. It's somebody's idea of what a bogeyman might look like. So it's a pretty straightforward process, and it has been successful.
Another question?
I had a question.
Yes, sir.
It's a little off of me, but...
Sir, we have a microphone coming for you there.
Roger,
Yeah.
there's a mic right there with Mandy.
I always thought that independent could run on a Supreme Court.
They can.
But on a petition basis? Or what?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you know,
Well, we've had independents on the Supreme Court that were nominated by...
well, Charlie Levin formed his own party, the Levin Party, and got on the
Yeah.
Supreme. So there's exceptions, but the general rule, Roger, is what I said. You got to go through the Republican Party convention or the Democratic Party convention. All 5 of them went through one of that process, and one of them is a libertarian who didn't, and he's running for the Supreme Court. So it's not as exclusive as it perhaps sounded the first time.
Well, if I wanted to run for the Supreme Court, if I got enough petition signatures, I could.
Yeah, I think so.
All right.
Well, and
You're a lawyer, get started.
Yeah, right.
do I have my 2 minutes?
You do.
Okay. I think John is correct. You would have to run as an independent. You would have to circulate probably signatures equal to you know, about 38,000 signatures, and then you could be on the ballot as an independent candidate. Charlie Levin, in fact, did do that, but he went the political party route. He went out and hired Kelly Temporary, and they circulated petitions, and they created his, I think it was the Judicial Party or something like that.
It's the 11 Party.
11 Party, okay.
That's what he called it.
And that party probably met in his basement and nominated Charles Levin for the state Supreme Court. And every time that he was running for re-election, he simply filed an affidavit of incumbency, and his name automatically appeared on the ballot.
With the words Justice of the Supreme Court under it. That was part of the Cook deal at ConCon 62-3. So an incumbent justice that wants to run for re-election has Justice of the Supreme Court under his name, which is viewed by all of us that have anything to know about this as an almost guarantee of re-election, because people don't have the time to figure out the qualities of judicial candidates. That's why they should be appointed.
And that applies to all judicial candidates running for district court judge or court of appeals judge or anything else.
Okay, very good. Another
George,
question?
I saw George had his hand up over here.
I don't have the mic right now, they're trying to fix it.
Okay.
Well, the point is that the nonpartisan judicial election is an oxymoron, but nobody does anything about it.
The ConCon should do something about it,
National
George.
Convention will give us an opportunity to do that.
Absolutely.
At the last Constitutional Convention, the issue as it related to the Supreme Court was whether we would continue the statutory practice of nominating Supreme Court justices by political party state conventions. And the other issue before the Constitutional Convention was, should the state Supreme Court be elected by district rather than statewide? After the convention kind of deadlocked on those two issues, they basically wrote the provision of the Constitution and used those famous words, nomination and election shall be provided by law. And so if the state legislature wanted to create 7 Supreme Court districts, they could pass a law. If it got signed by the governor, it would go into effect. And same with the partisan nomination. We could have the state Supreme Court, just by statute, not by constitutional amendment, change the election law and provide that the nomination of Supreme Court justices be done just like judges on the Michigan Court of Appeals, nonpartisan primary, and then nonpartisan general election.
That, I want to respond to Bob's comment, if I may. That overlooks the potential that we have to fix the problem. Some 40 states appoint justices to the Supreme Court. And the one that works best, the lawyers here will know it as the modified Missouri plan, is one that basically says, okay, we're going to have a merit-based independent commission. It can have R's and D's on it, but it's not going to be appointed by the parties or by the person in power who happens to be an R and D in the governor's chair. It will be an independent commission waiting for action so that when a vacancy occurs on the Supreme Court, they will study, interview, and pick 3 candidates, give them to the governor. He or she has to pick one or none, and if none, they go back to work 3 more until you get a justice. There is no election, there is no money like the $12 million we're going to spend this year, and if he wants to run at the end of 8 years, if we keep the 8-year term for Supremes, he runs on an up or down referendum. So we take the politics out of our Supreme Court. Retired United States Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor was here at Michigan Law School about 6 weeks ago, spoke to this topic, looking at the mess we've got with this zebra that we are doing things with, and said, you need an appointed system here of some kind. And I don't know a lawyer worth his salt in Michigan that doesn't wish we could have that, because the trust that we need the people to have for our justices and for our highest court is being seriously eroded by the partisan backbiting that's going on and by the money that's being spent The ads are absolutely outrageous. You would think that Bob Young was a terrorist if you listen to what the Democrats are saying about him, and it isn't any nicer coming the other way. I'm saying it's time for the citizens to say, no, we don't want this anymore. What we want to do is find a different way to do it and put it in the Constitution.
Thank you. We have a question right here from this gentleman.
I had a question. There was reference made to the possibility of amendment for specific issues. I was wondering, in the knowledge of either speaker, whether there is any action expressed for some amendment process for a particular issue or not? Or is everybody going to sit back and wait to the election whether we have a con-con or we don't have a con-con?
Oh, I think there are a number of groups that are thinking of some of the same issues, Don, that I'm trying to make you aware of tonight. And depending on what happens, if in fact we get a yes vote from all of you on November 2nd, we will do it at a constitutional convention. If not, because I think we are, those of us, Bob and I included, who are helping to raise the visibility of this issue, I certainly believe that if this does not pass on November 2nd, there will be a much better organized effort, one at a time, tough as it is, to bring things into focus that will fix some of these things. But the real challenge to all of you is, you've got an opportunity just by voting yes to make that happen, without anything more. And you know, the history of the Constitutional Conventions is not what this gentleman is telling you it is. They found a way to avoid those hot button issues and rewrite the things that they could agree to rewrite, knowing that their limitation was going to be what the people would vote yes on. And you know, it's not a given thing. Even in 1963, when they went to the ballot box, it won by 50.2% margin. It was almost a no. Only 400 votes statewide gave us the Constitution we have today. But that's an opportunity that I think we have too. If we put enough good things into it that people want, as opposed to what we've got now, that is a way to get them to vote yes.
Yep, rebuttal?
I think the politics of 1961 and the politics of today is drastically different. I think single issue groups are much more prevalent today than they were back in 1961. Both political parties, I think, were perhaps more balanced, more moderate than what you find today. And I think that there were outside groups that would welcome confrontation and get involved in the primary elections as well as the general elections for con-con delegate. And why wouldn't they? It's the only game in town. So in January and February of 2011, many of these groups that have been on both sides of some controversial issues that have made the statewide ballot, I think they would be involved in these primary elections and general elections and make and push their agenda and use that to raise funds across the country to come in and play in this constitutional convention in Michigan, because we will probably, if proposal B1 were to pass, we'd be the only game in town in calendar year 2011. That's a good reason, I think, to vote no.
Hey, we have a question back here.
Yeah, I was just wondering how, when you were talking about Michigan was turning into a service-based economy, how big of a role a constitutional convention would play in that, and how reasonable it is to, or that they would address that, and how effective it would be.
I think the most obvious way for them to recognize the change in our economy is to change our tax structure that will better reflect and raise money more fairly on an across-the-board basis. You know, we have a one-trick pony right now, a 4.35% income tax, that they can move the tax rate up or down very gently. That's all they're willing to do. But specifically on services, I think it's beyond obvious that we ought to, the legislature should be empowered to take a look at a tax on services. We have $100 million a year businesses that are not paying the tax because they can't put it in. They can't do it by legislation. They got to do it in the Constitution. So if they took that step, unless they just put a 3% tax in, which is below the income tax right now on services, we could probably solve the deficit, the structural deficit we got from that one stroke. If they put in a 246 graduated income tax, which would be more fair than a flat rate tax, 2% is below 435, and so is 4% is below 435 for the first third and second third, and 6% on the high-end people. That's still a low tax, and we would have enough money to solve our economic problem. They should empower the legislature to have those choices. Without having those choices, we're going to continue to strangle and starve.
Bob?
He's got a job.
John, I think that on this answer, you have definitely been disingenuous. Right now,
I'm shocked.
right now, the Michigan legislature is more than constitutionally empowered to raise the income tax. If they want to make the income tax more progressive, they can raise the personal exemption. If we want to have a sales tax and expand it to services, the Constitution does not restrict the legislature from doing that. In fact, Governor Granholm, then during this recent budget process, proposed that we raise some $600 million by the expansion of the sales tax to consumer services. Now, the legislature contemplated that and really didn't have the political will to go with a expansion of the sales tax to services, but there was absolutely nothing in the Michigan Constitution that would require a constitutional amendment, let alone a constitutional convention, to deal with the issue of taxation of expansion of the sales tax to consumer services.
Okay, thank you. We have a question in the back there.
Is it Bob?
Yes.
Are you affiliated with the Chamber of Commerce?
Yes, I'm employed by them.
And you're a representative of them right now?
That's correct.
What is the advantage to businesses to not have this happen?
I think the advantage of not having a constitutional convention is one of, I think, certainty. In fact, we embark upon a constitutional convention. We are going to have probably somewhere between 24 months and 33 months of uncertainty. Uncertainty as to what our governmental structure might look like, uncertainty as to what sort of taxation system they might have to pay on. And as a result, I think, and I think at least a number of businesses have expressed this position, that they're going to put Michigan on the pause button and say, we're going to decide to expand here after we see what kind of taxation system you design at this constitutional convention and what sort of governmental structure we have to operate under. So I think it's as simple as that.
Well, you've been hearing words like uncertainty, pause. I've also heard from this gentleman, we've got to give the new elected officials a chance. All of this kind of stuff fits into a pattern that is not very substantive, but can be very scary. And there's a word for this. It's called demagoguery. And the definition of it is pandering to the unfounded fears of the electorate. Unfounded is an important word because we've had 3 constitutional conventions before the one we're trying to have now. And none of these things ever happened. And he says, well, times are different now. No, they're not. Not if you read your history. In the 19th century, while people got up on the floor of the House of Representatives in Michigan and called each other, would make even the bad guys today look like saints, the way they talk back and forth to each other. Each generation, each half century, has its own mix of good and bad. But threatening us or being afraid, let me tell you what's happening here. The special interests, and don't, remember what I said? They spent $2.9 million trying to influence the judiciary race 2 years ago. These people have money to spend to try to get control. special interests on the left and the right have carved out their turf like the organized crime used to do in Chicago years ago. They fear losing territory. They have all helped run the state into the ground. That is the reality.
We have a question in the back there.
20 years ago, Michigan was 13th in the country for economic opportunity and economic job growth. Unfortunately, the last 5 or 6 years, we've been dead last. If one is attempting to shrink the size of government and CONCON doesn't go through, what's the probability of one amendment at a time trying to shrink the size of the government to make Michigan more competitive?
Well, I think there's always, I'm an optimist, I think there's always a potential opportunity, but the pace of it and the cost of it will make it go very, very slowly. We might get one every other year on the ballot. We might get two. We had two on the ballot in 2008, but you know where they came from? They came from initiative petitions by the people who got tired of waiting for the government, stuck as they were in the mire of the pseudo-religiosity overlay on scientific matters. So what did we get on the ballot? We got stem cell research. We got medical marijuana, both accepted scientific ways to deal with issues. And guess what happened? The people passed them. But, you know, it's going to take time and it's going to take money to get those signatures, and it's going to be slow, and there's no guarantee, and if it's badly worded and not clear to the voters, people that don't understand something, including CONCON this November, tend to vote no. What Benjamin Disraeli, the 19th century British Prime Minister, said, people prefer a familiar problem to an unfamiliar solution. That is the fight that people like me are waging now in the state of Michigan, to get you folks educated to the point where you can make an informed decision about what is going to help us move forward out of the morass that you very carefully and correctly have described.
Bob?
Bob,
Bob, do you want to respond to that?
Well, as one demagogue to another, I think we've already identified that there's probably nothing in the Michigan Constitution that is caused our economic crisis in this state. And frankly, I don't know if we can identify what we could put into the Michigan Constitution to basically get us out of this economic crisis. And, you know, I think we're going to have to look for solutions, you know, outside of the Michigan Constitution. The Michigan Constitution is supposed to set up a framework of government, and it's supposed to limit government on individuals. That's the purpose of a constitution. It isn't to write tax policy and put it all in one particular document. That's what the statutes are for. That's not what a constitution is for. So that would be my response.
The next question from the back.
And you're mentioning that we can correct the Constitution by increments. That sounds like too much like business today. And that is something that we have been living with. And I think what I'm not hearing from you, there's a word missing in your message. There's no hope in what you've been talking about tonight. So my vote is yes for a constitutional convention.
Who would like to respond to that?
Bravo!
Bob, did you have a response to that? Okay. We have yes, John.
Okay. The question that seems to be out here is that I don't see being answered with a Constitutional Convention is called accountability of elected officials. Whether we have one or don't have one, the individuals who are elected in November are accountable, and I think we are all at fault for not holding elected officials accountable, which doesn't require us to make a change in the Constitution, because that should be a framework. All this thing about tax policy and term limits, to me, is statutes and not a sense of a Constitution, because the hardest thing, I used to teach government classes, the hardest thing is that the state constitutions in the United States are far longer than the federal Constitution, because we just tend to want to put everything in the Constitution.
I think if we lived in a perfect world where every citizen fully understood and performed his duties as a citizen, then we might well be able to avoid what we're talking about having to do here. But let me give you a specific example of a problem and a specific solution that, unfortunately, I will argue to you, needs to be in the Constitution to get them to do their job correctly. In 2 of the last 3 years, they have failed to pass the budget on time. They moved the budget from June 30th to September 30th to hide their delinquency. Human nature took over. They were just as far behind the next year as they were before. What I'm suggesting that the CONCON consider is this language. If on or before each June 30th, I would lock it into the Constitution so the guys could not jerk it around again. The House of Representatives and Senate have not both passed a complete state budget, and the governor or lieutenant governor has not signed it into law. All pay and benefits for all 150 elected officials is suspended per diem until the foregoing is accomplished. Whereupon salaries and benefits will recommence. We're not just talking about salary, we're talking about every one of these benefits they've given to themselves without our voting on it, and saying no work, no pay. Now, I've been talking about that for 2 years, a lot longer than this issue's been alive, because if you're not going to act like grown-ups in Lansing, then we're not going to treat you like grown-ups. We're going to say to you, look, here's something you've got to live by, or it's going to cost you. I'm sorry to have to say we need to do that, but the world that you want us to live in is not the world we've got right now, unfortunately.
I first became acquainted with John Logie when he published an op-ed in the Grand Rapids Press on his particular idea. And I wrote back and I said, I think that's a great idea, but you chose the wrong method. We don't need to have a constitutional convention, go out and elect 148 delegates to accomplish this particular change in the Michigan Constitution. First of all, the Michigan Constitutional Convention route will take a minimum, if 61, 62 is any guide, of 33 months before the Logie Amendment could go into effect. And had John devoted his energies and talents, which I know he possesses, to putting this on the 2012 ballot, or lobbying the state legislature to put this on the 2012 ballot.
That's a good idea.
They're going to vote for that.
Right. But that is the reason why I think this is just constitutional overkill to take the Logie Amendment and say we can only do it through a constitutional convention.
Well, I'm happy to see that something's about to happen in this room. I just want to insert myself here to make this comment. Back during the founding of this country, when John Adams was going to Philadelphia to help build a national government, Abigail Adams wrote him and said, "Remember the ladies." And I've been waiting for one of the ladies in this room to ask a question, and now we're about to have our first lady do so. Thank you. Karen.
And maybe you don't want to address this, but I'm very interested in part-time, I know that I'm interested in a positive way, but I'm curious about how part-time legislatures work in other states, if there's a model for it. I'm wondering what kind of candidate does this attract? Is it a higher quality? I mean, I just am curious about how this works. Since we're in the minority, I just don't know how it works in the majority states that do have part-time legislatures. I want to know what part-time legislatures do the rest of the time. I just can't figure out how that works.
Well, many of them are attorneys. And you'll find that in state legislatures across the United States that are part-time legislature, probably the largest occupational grouping in the legislature are attorneys. Because then, you know, when the legislature's not in session, they can go back to the practice of law. In some other states that have part-time legislatures, you have the situation where you have probably a lot more retirees serve in the in state legislatures that have a part-time legislature. First of all, the compensation isn't all that great, but a part-time legislature comes with certain consequences as well. And one is that all of a sudden we have to worry a little bit more about conflicts of interest. If in fact you're employed by some company or some union, do you have certain inherent conflicts of interest serving as a legislature in a part-time legislature situation where you're drawing some compensation from the state as a member of that legislative body, but being really employed by an employer that may have an interest in what happens at the state legislature. So there are some, there's some trade-offs between a part-time legislature and a full-time legislature.
The biggest difference is the cost of government. Remember where I started tonight, Karen, with the Department of Energy? And there are billions and billions of dollars of expense. That's what our legislature has grown into, is 140 fat cats who, when they bumped their salaries from $44,000 to $74,000, said, well, it's a full-time job now. Now, I know for a fact, without naming names, that of the 23 lawyers who are in the House or the Senate, most of them are practicing law one way or another. They're not playing by the rules. So the rule actually is hurting us. But the part-time legislators, because it is a part-time job, are much closer to the reality of a con-con, a finite job that people go to for a while and then come away from. And yet they provide the basic services of government, some better than others. But they're, Vermont and New Hampshire sit side by side with each other. One's got a whole bunch of taxes, the other one has almost none. Both of them have part-time legislatures, but the one with all the taxes is a much bigger and much more active legislature. So the generalization that I can give you without specifics, because I don't have them in my file at this point, specifics on specific other states, but I can make this generalization with a good deal of confidence that indeed it's costing people a lot less to have a government that is part-time, and we are paying for a supposedly full-time group thinking of ways to spend their money.
Thank you. Last question. Jason Duncan.
Jason Duncan, Point College. One of the frequent complaints of American politics is apathy, lack of interest, lack of knowledge by voters. I wonder if a constitutional convention for this generation of Michiganders might get people interested in government, might get young people interested in making the Constitution. It could actually have a civic benefit for a convention to be held, and people would take it apart and actually fill a state government that they might not feel at this point.
Well, I think so. I mean, I think that that's an ever possible opportunity, because this is not the government working as government. It's a group of citizens trying to make good decisions about how we can improve our seminal document that controls our laws and the rules under which our elected officials have to operate. And, my work with young people, the Logie Fellowship is one of the examples. These folks are interested. They want to participate. They're trying to find a way why. I believe some of them will show up as candidates for the con-con, and they will come and they will teach us old guys. I don't plan to be there, but the guys my age that might be there, something that they need to know from young people. Why not deal with that one as the glass is half full? I think it might be, and I think I want to give those young people a chance to get involved in government, just like the scholarship is designed to get them inside City Hall, to get a first-hand experience of how local government operates.
I probably share Mayor Logie's attitude that this is a teachable moment, and young people might get motivated to be interested in their government, and I think you can only applaud that particular activity. I don't necessarily think that a constitutional convention is going to be called on after the November 2nd election. But nonetheless, if it were, that becomes a teachable moment.
Thank you very much for the questions and answers. Now we come to the conclusion of our event. We're going to have 3 minutes of closing argument from each of you. Bob, you get to go first.
Well, I want to contrast what is happening here in 2010 to what happened 16 years ago in 1994 and 16 years before that in 1978. John Logie, I think, is to be congratulated for stepping forward and articulating a position on the call for a constitutional convention. Now, of course, he's wrong, but nonetheless, with generally civility, except calling me a demagogue on almost every meeting. John has, I think, been an advocate for the position that voters should approve the call for a constitutional convention on November 2nd. I think that all of the reasons that I've articulated earlier this evening still apply. I think that we can, I think a constitutional convention in 2011 will be an open invitation to every single interest group in the state, in the nation, to come to Michigan in February and try to influence the nomination and eventual election of CONCON delegates so that their particular pet project somehow is debated at the Constitutional Convention. Whether it's incorporated into the Michigan Constitution is another question. Because I think under that atmosphere, we face a situation where probably the work product of such a constitutional convention will ultimately be rejected by the voters of the state of Michigan like they did back in 1867. And so we will have gone through a $45 million exercise, and what will we have accomplished for that? All at the same time, we have this new leadership coming in, and I think they deserve an opportunity to start to try to reboot Michigan's economy without the activity of a constitutional convention 3 blocks to the east. And with that, John, I turn to you and for your summation.
Recent poll, well, let me back up. In 1978, which wasn't even a full 16 years after we passed this current Constitution, it was on the ballot. There was nobody advocating to let's have a CONCON then. There were people, the Michigan Chamber being, and this guy personally, who were saying, no, we don't want to do this. And they got an overwhelmingly no vote. In 1994, I was the mayor here. I was aware of it, thanks to Dorothy Judd. I knew it was on the ballot. But if you remember the economy of the 90s, what it was doing, and did the whole 90s until the dot-com bubble in 2000, I didn't have any reason to suggest to my city commission that we get on this horse and ride it. Nobody did. But the chamber was an ardent and aggressive no. And they got a 72% no vote. I think that those don't mean anything today. I'm not the only voice in this state saying yes is the right answer. There are a lot of us. The Detroit Free Press came out with a yes. The Oakland Press came out, the biggest paper in Oakland County, second largest county in the state, came out with a yes. Some have come out with no's. But there's a lot more activity going on now, and it's important because if you don't do anything else, whether you're on his side or mine, tell people it's on the ballot and a little bit what it's about. That will help us get an informed decision by the citizens. Now, I want to give you one last story, and it's probably I'm the only guy that you're going to talk to that can do this. When I was mayor, one of my State of the City addresses was on drug reform. And I made a call to ask for volunteers to serve on a commission to study that for up to a year and make recommendations of what we could fix. And I thought I might get 15 or 20 volunteers. I got 103. And after I read all their resumes and I didn't want to lose any of them. Well, I had a retired Navy captain buddy of mine from here, had come back. We put them into 3 platoons. He ran it. They came back with 6 wonderfully solid recommendations. They said, we think we ought to have a drug court. We have a drug court now, perhaps. We think we ought to have a free needle exchange. But remember this, I had active druggies in this. I had recovering druggies. I had healthcare providers, I had doctors, I had lawyers, I had citizens. They did what this CONCON will do if we give them a chance. There will be a core group of people that want to do the right thing, want to get the job done, and want to come back to you with a document that you are going to say yes on. That's what we ought to look forward to. And thank you for being able to. Questions were wonderful tonight. A very good audience. This was just the right size room to do all of this.
Thank you very much. That concludes our debate this evening, but just a couple of things. You know, we learned somewhere along the way that two of the most important words in the English language are thank you. And there are a lot of people to thank this evening. Very briefly, I'd like to thank Ralph Hauenstein for making possible such forums and debates as this. Reverend Wooden for opening up this beautiful facility, this structure for such debates. Also, we have an advisory cabinet at the Hauenstein Center. Hillary Snell heads it, but Fred Bogart, Marilyn Teich, Mary Seeger are part of it. I thank them for their support for what we do. Thank you all. And most of all, tonight, I certainly want to thank John Logie and Bob LaBrant for giving us a debate that didn't generate so much heat, but generated a lot of light. Appreciate very much your bringing your shtick to us here in Grand Rapids. Thank you so much. And the one last thing I want to do here for these two gentlemen, since if you'll stand in front of the podiums.
Oh my goodness.
Anybody who earns their key gets a Ralph Hauenstein signature tote bag. We want to thank you very much.